Thanks, Anthony. Anthony and Nick and Louis Coiffet from the Pearson organization have been built a rather full schedule for me. So if I fall asleep in the middle of my talk, you'll understand why it is. But I have had an extremely interesting 3 days this week, and I also had the opportunity to come in and participate in the World Skills Forum at the end of last week, which was a really extraordinary event for those of you who made your way out to the Excel Center in London. You have the Pathways to Prosperity report in your packets. I'm going to talk about some of both the background of the report and some of the themes without trying to, in 20 or 25 minutes, run through the entire report. I'll simply say this is a product of actually three of us, two who are faculty members at Harvard. My colleague Ron Ferguson is an economist who has a joint appointment between the Kennedy School, which is our public policy and government school, and the education school where I'm based. And Ron is best known, at least in the US, for his work on the racial achievement gap. And the third member of our team was a person that we kind of recruited, who's a former journalist named Bill Simons, who spent most of his career working for Business Week, including covering education. And I'm really, even though I now live in a university, I'm not really an academic. I'm a kind of policy activist who's moved in and out of government and nonprofit and foundation work. So we brought three different kind of skill sets and perspectives. Obviously, Bill's huge contribution as a journalist was to do most of the writing, and I think one reason the report has gotten the kind of take-up it has in the States is that it's written in a very accessible journalistic style, although we did try to bring together a fair amount of data. There's no real original research in this report. It really is more a kind of compilation of what we have learned from various studies, and we really try to construct an argument. To understand why this report has created some controversy as well as some genuine interest on the part of policymakers in the U.S., you have to understand at least a little bit about the kind of education policy / political context in the last 20 years. And I think here there really is a parallel between what's happened in the U.S. during this last 20-year period and what's happened in the U.K. as well. The dominant movement in which I've been a kind of central participant in over this 20-year period has been what we call the academic standards movement. It's essentially been an effort to really kind of reassert that the core business of our elementary and secondary education system is to provide all students with a solid foundation of knowledge and skills to be able to then have choices once they graduate. And I think, as most of you probably know, we're a federal system, 50 states. Each state has come at this challenge of trying to create clearer, more rigorous academic standards independently. Each state has developed its own set of assessments to measure progress against those standards. And it's been frankly, looked at from the outside, a bit of a mess, but we've been sort of slowly making progress. And in the last year or two, over 40 states have kind of come together voluntarily and said this business of trying to proceed state by state, not only in a highly mobile society, but in an economy which is obviously increasingly global, this makes no sense. So we now have over 40 states that have agreed to adopt what we're calling our Common Core standards. We have those states have organized themselves into two different consortia to develop two different assessment systems, but proceeding in parallel with somewhat different philosophy. But at the end of the day, we think we'll have a much richer set of assessments against which to, or with which to measure progress against our standards. All of this, at least is, and I should say, in the mid-90s, there was a big national education summit that brought together our 50 governors. Each governor was asked to bring a corporate chief executive from his state or her state who'd been highly active in education issues. And out of that meeting, there was a sense at the time that progress was a bit stalled. The governors and CEOs decided they would create a new organization to try to encourage the states to make more progress and move along in the raising of standards and the building of assessment and accountability systems. And they asked me to head up this new organization. So I spent the 97 through 2002 leading an organization called Achieve, which has continued to be right in the center of the kind of now the movement toward Common Core standards. Somehow over this period, the idea of giving all kids a solid foundation of academic knowledge and skills has morphed into the idea that all young people need to go on to a four-year college, and college for all has become a kind of a mantra. Vocational education in the U.S., well, obviously we have states that have strong vocational systems. We have a few national programs, a couple of which I will mention. We have pockets of excellence, but by and large, vocational education has developed over the 20th century almost as a kind of separate system from our kind of mainstream system. And within our comprehensive high schools, which unfortunately have typically been tracked, that is with an academic track, a general education track, and a vocational education track, vocational education has always struggled for status and recognition. And in this last 20 years, if anything, the kind of status of vocational education has diminished even further. In the late 80s, and actually when Ron Ferguson, Bill Simons, and I began talking about this what became this Pathways project, we were mindful of the fact that about 20 years earlier, a report had been written in the U.S. that captured a fair amount of attention at the time called The Forgotten Half. And the Forgotten Half, after the Forgotten Half, the colon was, the non-college bound youth in America. And in that era, we really did think about those going to college and those not going to college. And the point of the report was that as a society, we were providing much less support. We were spending about $10 on every college-bound youth once they left school for every $1 spent on non-college-bound youth. And in a whole variety of ways, we were really kind of reinforcing a kind of two-class system. So our question and the jumping off point for our report was, okay, 20-something years later, how much progress have we made? Do we still have a forgotten half of young people? As I mentioned before, there's been this increasing kind of pressure around college as the expectation, as once you graduate from high school. When you survey high school students in America and ask, what are you going to do after you graduate from high school, over 90% say they are going off to a 2- or 4-year college or university. By the way, we use college and university kind of interchangeably, so bear with me, but we do have 2-year institutions analogous to the further education colleges here called community colleges, and then a wide variety of 4-year institutions, some of which are universities and some of which are colleges, that is, that do not have serve only kind of undergraduate students. As I say, if you survey students while they're in school, over 90% say they're going off to college. In fact, over 70% of those who graduate from high school within a year do enroll in a 2- or 4-year institution. But if you ask the more important question, which is by age 25, what proportion of young people have either a 2- or 4-year college degree, the answer is about 30% have a 4-year degree, and another 10% have a 2-year degree. And those numbers have been fairly static. In fact, it's become a political issue in the U.S. that every time OECD releases its education at a glance, what you see is that the U.S. college completion rates have remained relatively static while other countries have been moving past us. I tend to think that reaction to these international polls is sometimes kind of overstated, to put it mildly. But the fact is that despite all of this rising pressure around college going and around academics, we really have barely moved the needle in terms of college completion. Now, 40% of 25-year-olds with a college or university degree actually it's not such a bad thing at all. In fact, if you looked at Switzerland, for example, or Germany, but Switzerland in particular, I think of as #1 in the World Economic Forum. It has a significantly smaller fraction of its people with a 2- or 4-year college degree. The problem for us is that unlike any other industrial country, we have not built an alternative system to help young people get from high school to work. The only way really to get credentialed in our society as it's currently structured, it's a bit of an exaggeration but not much, is to go through a sort of 2- or 4-year college pathway. So essentially our argument is, and by the way, we then generously, in addition to the 40% with a college degree, we add another 10% of young people who have gotten some form of occupational certificate that has currency in the labor market. Typically, our community colleges often offer a range of certificate programs. Only the ones that are 1 year or more seem to have much currency in the labor market. So our point was, guess what? In this increasingly challenging economy, we still have roughly half of our young people who are arriving at their mid-20s, in some ways an even greater risk than their counterparts 20 years earlier, when it was still possible to actually move into the job market without credentials, and you know, if you were highly motivated and energetic, you could still make your way. So that's the jumping off point for our report. We then looked at kind of the labor market side of the equation and asked, are there in fact jobs for young people who have some skills, who have a high school diploma, some education or training beyond high school, but not necessarily a college degree. And the best labor market projections that, at least the ones that, as you know, labor economists tend to argue back and forth about these matters. But despite a lot of the earlier predictions that we were kind of moving toward an economy in which there were only going to be high-skilled jobs and low-skilled jobs, in which the middle essentially was being hollowed out, we now think there's pretty robust evidence that there will continue to be roughly a third of the new jobs and replacement jobs over the next decade that will really be these kind of middle-skilled jobs, jobs that typically require some kind of technical skills, but not necessarily, certainly not necessarily a 4-year college degree. We issued this report in a press event in Washington with the U.S. Education Secretary, Arne Duncan, and with a panel representing the kind of political coalition that we think it's going to take to actually move this agenda forward, with a major employer, a senior person from IBM, the president of a very effective 2-year college close to D.C., Northern Virginia Community College, serving 78,000 students, and a big city school superintendent. Once the report hit, and you never know when you issue these reports what the take-up is going to be, we have had a pretty steady stream of requests to come and meet with leaders, really all in more than half the states around the country, and speak at national conferences. Most of that work has been done by Bill Simons, the journalist, who's the one. Ron Ferguson and I both have day jobs as faculty members. But when I've gone out, what I've been struck by, particularly in meetings with political leaders in states and with employers, is that what we keep hearing is that in the IT sector, in the healthcare sector, in the advanced manufacturing sector, even in this economy, there continue to be jobs, but jobs that are going begging because we simply have a mismatch between the skills of both the incumbent adult workforce and, more importantly for our purposes, the skills of the younger workforce coming out of the market. About 3 weeks ago, my wife and I were invited to spend a morning in the state of Maine. The governor there, small state, highly rural, demographically the oldest state in the country. So a state that really does. You have the feeling that this is a state that's kind of running out of young people. So the importance of trying to make sure that every young person has the kind of skills to be able to participate in the economy is something that's felt kind of palpably. The governor, in a very interesting way, kind of invited in 25 corporate CEOs from around the state, and it's a small state, everyone knows one another. He said no substitutes, and we got there at 9 o'clock in the morning in the governor's mansion, and 25 seats around a big conference table were filled. And he simply said, I just want to sit and listen for the next hour or so and have you tell me what your workforce challenges are. And again, the typical range of employers, some of the largest employers in the state across various sectors, healthcare, finance, manufacturing, et cetera. And over again, the message was, we in fact do have jobs, we have plans to expand, but the limiting factor for us is having access to a workforce that has the skills that we need. As it happened that month, when the job listings came out in Maine, there were almost an identical number of people seeking jobs and jobs seeking people, but mismatch again in terms of skills. When jump ahead for a second and then come back to this theme. But at there's a big chunk of our report that really focuses on lessons from Europe, and particularly from Northern Europe. And I'll say a lot more about that in a couple of minutes. But in the final section of the report, we made a deliberate decision not to kind of lay out a very explicit set of recommendations, which at least in the US, the typical reports aimed at kind of governmental policymakers have a long laundry list of to-dos. The federal government must do this, states must do that, localities must do this, employers must do that, educators must do this. We really wanted our report primarily to kind of touch off a conversation. We wanted to cast a searchlight on this problem of the consequence of not having a developed set of alternative pathways to help young people get from secondary school into the labor market with skills and credentials. So we decided to simply have three broad themes, if you will, in the recommendations section of the report. The first one was simply making this case for the creation of multiple pathways, alternative pathways, with some standing that combined strong academic preparation with technical preparation. President Obama in January of 2009 made an appeal basically speaking to young people and said, every young person not only needs to complete high school, but needs to get at least 1 year of some form of post-secondary education or training. Now, saying this in a country in which there really aren't systems to do this is a bit of a challenge, but he articulated a goal which we have kind of endorsed in our report. He went on to say it can be an apprenticeship program. Well, our apprenticeship programs are a tiny fraction of the offerings in the U.S. Technical program, 1 year program, community college program, whatever. But this was, at least for us, a way of beginning to legitimize the notion that we need some pathways other than the sort of conventional 4-year college pathway. I should point out, by the way, as you might infer from the statistics I cited at the beginning, we have, although large numbers of people start out in higher education, in our 4-year institutions, only slightly more than half of those who start actually complete a degree within 6 years. In our 2-year institutions, the dropout rate, if you want to call it that, is much, much higher. 2-year institutions obviously serve a sort of multiplicity of purposes, so some people don't enroll with the intention of getting a degree, so these comparisons are a bit tricky. But the point is, we have huge participation, but we have huge numbers of people who manage to move through our institutions without getting themselves a degree or credential. After our report came out, let me come back and complete the three sort of areas of recommendations. So one set of recommendations really focused on the need to build these alternative pathways. A second recommendation, this is obviously directly relevant to the theme of this conference, is we need a strategy to engage our employer community much more seriously in addressing this problem. And one of the things that was striking to me in this meeting in Maine was that the employers were basically saying, we understand that this is our problem in a sense. They weren't pointing fingers at the schools. They weren't complaining about young people. They were basically saying, we have to figure out a way to get together, to combine our resources, and to figure out a strategy ourselves to create incentives for young people. But what they wanted from government, interestingly, what they said to the governor, and again, obviously governments all over the U.S. are broke the way your government is here in the U.K. So the traditional, there was very little talk about public expenditure in this meeting. But what they argued was that one of the roles that government can play is really trying to educate parents and young people about the economy and about the kinds of changes taking place in the economy and the kinds of skills and preparation that young people need in order to be prepared to participate in the economy. And in Maine, at least a highly rural state, there was a big theme around raising aspirations of young people and enabling young people and their families to understand that a high school education, at least in this economy, is no longer good enough. So second big theme, engaging employers, and I'll come back and talk more about that when I come back and talk about the lessons from Europe. And then the third theme was really what we were calling the importance of developing a very visible, explicit kind of compact between adult society and young people. And this does lead me back to the Northern Europe experience. My wife and I've actually twice now over the last 15 years had opportunities to participate in these OECD policy studies that look across a whole set of participating countries. There was a study in the late 90s called From Schooling to Initial Working Life. I was part of the review team that looked at the Australian education and employment system then. And then in 2010, my wife and I spent 3 months at OECD in the last stages of a 16-country look called Learning for Jobs. And if you haven't seen that report, I would really recommend it. I actually took part, it was one of the 3-person review team looking at the German system. It was one of the, I think it was the last of the countries being visited prior to the report being released 9 or 10 months later. What was most striking to us is that all across Northern Europe, between 40 and 70% of young people, roughly from the age of 16, move into these highly structured, typically 3-year programs that combine work and learning, that have very strong employer involvement in the design of the programs, in the development of curriculum, in the quality review process, in the assessment and certification of young people at the end of the day. So these programs are very tightly aligned with the kind of emerging needs of the labor market. They are well-resourced through a combination of employer investment directly in young people, especially in the apprenticeship countries, where typically young people are spending 3.5 days a week learning at the workplace, and then 1.5 days a week with kind of aligned academics, understanding the kind of the theory behind what they are learning at the workplace. These, and again, from an American perspective, what was so striking about these programs, in addition to the widespread employer engagement, is that these are mainstream programs. And obviously, if you're serving between 40 and 70% of young people, Switzerland is, for me, the kind of gold standard among the European systems at this point. 70% of young people. These are not programs designed for kids who, quote, can't do academic work. They're not programs designed for at-risk youth that other people don't know quite what to do with. These are challenging, rigorous programs and that have a lot of appeal both to young people and to employers. In Switzerland, in particular, there are no government subsidies for employers. The government invests very heavily the government supports the education side and invests heavily in developing the kind of infrastructure to support employer participation. But the employers really pay their own way because they see this as a kind of long-term investment in their future workforce. Switzerland is particularly interesting to us because, unlike Germany, its economy, its labor market is much less regulated than the German labor market. In that sense, more fluid, more open, more like the U.S. Labor market. The other country that particularly fascinates me, and I think the standard criticism from the U.S., and it's one I share, of the German system, and to some degree even the Swiss system, is that the schools make decisions about which kids are kind of university bound much earlier in the game than we do. But the further north you go in Europe, the less likely it is to find any form of tracking. Finland and Denmark, Finland in particular, is impressive in that all young people go through the same common basic education, untracked, up through grade 9. And then at grade 10, people have choices. And here in Finland, again, high-performing country, high-performing economy. 45%, I was told last week, of young people now are opting for the vocational path rather than the university path. I should say, by the way, in thinking about vocational versus university, these systems have, by and large, been smart enough to make sure that there continue always to be pathways back to further education. And Switzerland, in particular, has a very strong kind of tertiary vocational system beyond its upper secondary system, with very strong participation, and in fact routes that can lead you all the way through to a doctoral degree, starting out as an apprentice, as the woman who happens to run the Office of Professional Education and Technology announced at the World Skills Forum last week. She runs that part of the system. She's also a university professor with a PhD, and she started as an apprentice. So those were the The youth compact idea really has kind of two origins. I mean, on the one hand, it really is our notion in looking at these European systems is that, yes, they are designed mainly to support young people's transition from school to work, but they also have a broader social purpose. They really are designed to support the transition of young people from adolescence to adulthood. The actual technical skills that young people are asked to master in many of these programs really don't require 3 years. And if you ask employers or researchers who study these systems, does it really take 3 years to learn to be, whatever the occupation is? And often the answer will be no, but this is as much about socialization and kind of the support for young people through what we know is a difficult transition. To come back to the question, from a U.S. perspective is, why is it that 45% of young Finns would, for example, would opt for the vocational track? Well, the obvious answer is, for an awful lot of young people, I would argue that perhaps half of young people, the prospect of sitting in classrooms and learning only in classrooms with other people in your own age cohort for another 2 or 3 years as you finish the upper secondary school and then several more years at the university, that option is against the option of moving at age 16 or 17 into a more adult setting, testing yourself against adult norms with support in the apprenticeship systems, getting paid while you're doing that, and within 3 years being able to be kind of fully credentialed so that you can move into the labor market. That's an attractive option for a lot of people. And I think that has as much to do with kind of learning styles as it does with anything else. If you think about how we train kind of high-end professionals these days, the notion of mixing academic and clinical training is absolutely taken as a kind of given, at least in the professional schools, at my university, in medicine, in law, in business. The clinical training is a core component of the education process, and it doesn't wait until the end of the line. It's at Harvard Medical School, right from the first year, aspiring doctors are getting a mix of clinical practice as well as academic practice. I just want to say a couple of more things and then open this up. How am we doing on time here, Anthony?
Yeah, you're good. Yeah, 2 more minutes.
Okay. Three interesting kind of reports, news stories primarily, appeared shortly after our report was released, which kind of added fuel to the fire around the argument that we've been making. The first one was a report that got picked up in on a front page story in the New York Times about the fate of the class of 2010, that is graduates of four-year colleges who graduated in 2010. Over 40% of those young people a year later were either unemployed or, more typically, employed in jobs that didn't really require a four-year college degree. Second report out of the state of Florida showed that, looking at graduates from the class of 2009, those, and this is all kind of within the public college and university sector in Florida, those with a 2-year technical degree were out-earning those with a 4-year degree by about $10,000. And again, this is in the first stages of their careers. Whether those kinds of differentials hold up over time is another matter. Third story was a book released just shortly after our report by 2 sociologists called Academically Adrift, which followed 2,400 young people, a cross-section of students in four-year institutions, cross-section of institutions from highly selective to quite unselective, asking the question, what's the evidence that they actually have, the evidence of their learning, at least as measured? We have one higher education assessment, the collegiate learning assessment, that has some kind of standing in the US, and it's very kind of problem-based, project-based, and the students were administered a form of that assessment as they walked in the door in their first year, at the end of their second year, and then again at the end of their fourth year. And the 3 things being measured were really kind of analytic reasoning, critical thinking and problem solving, and analytic writing. The 45% of the sample showed no discernible improvement between the beginning of the freshman year and the end of the second year. Even by the end of 4 years, 36% showed no discernible improvement. And the authors kind of speculate with interviews, what's really going on here? Is this a problem of weak preparation? Is it a problem of higher education lowering its standards and expectations? What came through for me, particularly in the interviews with students, and again, you always look for confirming evidence of your own hypotheses, I suppose, but it was clear that an awful lot of kids, as the title of the book would suggest, had drifted into four-year institutions without a plan, partly because they're just in our society, if you're middle class in particular, and your parents have a checkbook, there is no other socially legitimate place to go after high school. So when I and my colleagues started to go on the circuit and particularly do radio talk shows, what was really striking to me was the phone lines were filled with parents of middle-class kids who were basically saying, given the high cost of college, a phenomenon that the UK is about to experience as fees go up, but given the high cost of college, we used to believe that investing in higher education was absolutely a sure thing. The more education you got, the better off you were going to be. Any kind of college degree was going to ensure that you were better off than not having such a degree. Well, what we're now seeing, and again from the economists whose work we cite at the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, we're now seeing that that's no longer the case. It depends what you study, not how many years of schooling, but what you study and what skills you emerge with. And we think that there's this now kind of rising concern among middle-class families around this question of, is this pressure around four-year colleges as the only legitimate route for young people, does this make sense? I mention this because, at least in our society, I think it's, and this is an analysis from a sociologist, William Julius Wilson, now at Harvard, in an early book called The Truly Disadvantaged, and it's something that's kind of stayed with me. He argues that the only social programs that have really showed staying power in the U.S. are programs that are not explicitly targeted to poor people, but are more universal in their design, but within their design have a particularly strong kind of targeting or equity focus. And I mention that, and that connects back to my earlier point about these European systems being mainstream systems. As long as what we now call career and technical education, a kind of terminology change to begin to get out from the sort of some of the old stigma attached to vocational education, but also a way of acknowledging that more and more of what we used to think of vocational education, the best programs really do have a very strong kind of technical focus these days. But as long as we continue to believe, as we do in our country, that vocational education or career and technical education is a great thing, but it's a great thing for other people's children, not our own, this is not a problem that we're likely to make much traction on. So the notion of trying to build a kind of political coalition, if you will, that where anxious middle-class families, as well as the families of kids who really are being shut out of the economy, can kind of get together and see a kind of commonality of interest. For me, at least, that's the only kind of prospect I can imagine for building the kind of political support that we need over time to move in the direction of building the kinds of systems that characterize the strongest European countries. So what we and I and my colleagues in partnership with a nonprofit organization called Jobs for the Future, which is a Boston-based education and workforce organization that has a lot of experience working in this realm, we together are kind of setting out now to find 3 to 5 states among the many states that have been asking us for help, to find 3 to 5 states where we think there's the right combination of corporate and political and education leadership that's willing to really kind of get together and commit to a long-term strategy to try to move us away from our kind of essentially programmatic focus to really build the kind of systems that over time can really provide these kind of transparent pathways that can start to pick young people up even in the middle grade years and move them on through high school. And we have a huge high school completion problem, by the way, I should say. Only about 25% of our young people don't even make it to the finish line in high school. And by the way, when you ask them, why do you drop out of school? Surprise, surprise, they say, because they don't see the connection between what they're being asked to study in school and any future they can imagine for themselves. And for a lot of young people who are on the margins, saying to them the reason to stay in high school is so you can go on to college and sit in academic classrooms for several more years is not exactly an enticing prospect. So in any event, our goal is to try to find 3 to 5 states that we can work with over time to try to build some systems, invite leaders from other states who are interested to kind of look over the shoulder of these 3 states and see if we can continue to kind of have a public conversation to get people to understand the consequences of traveling so single-mindedly down this kind of college for all role. You'll hear more about the U.S. System and our situation later from my colleague Jim Stone, who runs the National Center for Research on Career and Technical Education in the U.S. and is one of the most knowledgeable people in the country about our system. But Jim and I were just talking beforehand. The mantra these days in our states is all young people need to be college and career ready. But the reality is there's been almost no attention paid to the career side of the equation, and we still behave as if some people are in fact going off to college and other people are going off to work, rather than having a kind of careers, an understanding that college isn't a destination in itself. It's simply one pathway to one set of careers, and we need to build other pathways to other set of careers. We need to invest much, much more in career information and counseling and support for young people and their families from an earlier age so they can understand better where this economy is going. And then we need, if we're going to move toward a system where it's at all similar to the best European systems, where at the end of what in most of Europe is lower secondary education, let's say at the end of grade 9 or grade 10, young people are asked to make choices. We need to make sure that there's the opportunity for those choices to be informed. That's the kids and their families making the choices, not the schools themselves. I think I will stop there, Anthony, and open up for questions or comments.